I need to tell you about something that happened to me 6 months ago, something that completely changed the way I think about the building I live in, about elevators, and about the spaces that exist between the floors we think we know. I live in the Meridian Tower, a 40-story apartment complex in downtown Chicago that was built in 1987 and has been home to hundreds of families over the decades. It's one of those sleek glass and steel buildings that looks impressive from the outside, but feels sterile and corporate once you're inside, with long beige hallways, fluorescent lighting, and the kind of industrial carpeting that somehow manages to look dirty even when it's clean. What I didn't know, what none of us residents knew, was that our building contains architectural features that should be impossible, floors that exist in spaces that were never designed, never approved, and never meant to be accessed by ordinary people like us. Let me know in the comments if you've ever noticed something strange about the elevators in your own apartment building, because what I'm about to tell you might make you pay a lot more attention to those buttons you press every day. I moved into Meridian Tower 2 years ago, apartment 2847 on the 28th floor, and in all that time, I had taken the elevator hundreds, maybe thousands of times without ever really looking at the button panel. It's one of those things you do on autopilot. You get in, you press your floor, you wait, you get out. The elevator has 2 panels, one for floors 1 through 20 and another for floors 21 through 40, plus the standard basement parking levels marked as P1, P2, and P3. Nothing unusual, nothing that would make you look twice or think there was anything strange about the building's design. But 3 weeks ago, during a particularly severe thunderstorm that knocked out power to most of downtown Chicago, I discovered something that has haunted my dreams and made me question everything I thought I knew about the place I call home. I was coming back from a late shift at the marketing firm where I work, exhausted and soaked from running through the rain from the parking garage to the lobby. The elevator was one of the few things still functioning during the power outage, running on emergency backup power that cast everything in a dim, eerie red glow. As I stepped inside and reached for the button for the 28th floor, the building's emergency systems flickered, causing the elevator panel to go completely dark for about 5 seconds before the backup lighting kicked in. When the lights came back up, I noticed something that stopped me cold and made my blood run like ice water through my veins. There, between the button for P3 and the button for the first floor, was another button I had never seen before. It was marked 13, in the same standard white lettering as all the other floor buttons. But I knew with absolute certainty that this button had never been there during the 2 years I had been riding this elevator. The basement levels only went down to P3, and there was no floor 13 anywhere in the building plans, no negative 13th floor in the architectural blueprints, no reason for such a button to exist. Hit the like button if you're already getting chills, because what happened when I pressed that button changed my life in ways I'm still trying to understand. My first instinct was to assume this was some kind of maintenance feature, maybe a service level or mechanical floor that was only accessible during emergencies, but the more I stared at that button, the more wrong it felt. The font was exactly the same as all the other floor markers. The placement was perfectly aligned with the rest of the panel, and it had the same slightly worn appearance as buttons that had been in use for years. This wasn't a new addition or a temporary feature. This button looked like it had been there since the building was constructed. I should have pressed 28 and gone home. I should have ignored the impossible button and chalked it up to exhaustion or the stress of the power outage. But curiosity, that fatal human flaw that has gotten our species into trouble since the beginning of time, made me reach out and press 13 instead. The moment my finger made contact with that button, I felt something that I can only describe as an electric shock. Not painful, but definitely noticeable. Like static electricity, but somehow more purposeful, more alive. The elevator lurched slightly, made a grinding sound I had never heard before, and then began to move. But it didn't move up toward the residential floors like I expected. It moved down, past P1, past P2, past P3, continuing to descend into depths of the building that I knew didn't exist. The digital floor indicator above the doors, which normally showed clear white numbers, began displaying symbols I didn't recognize, strange geometric shapes that seemed to shift and change as I watched them. The elevator continued its impossible descent for what felt like minutes, but was probably only 30 or 40 seconds, going deeper underground than the building's foundation should have allowed. Subscribe if you want to hear more stories about impossible architecture and supernatural spaces hidden in plain sight, because what I found when those elevator doors opened was beyond anything I could have imagined. The first thing I noticed was the smell, not the typical basement odor of concrete and machinery, but something organic and wrong, like flowers that had been left to rot in stagnant water. The air itself felt different, thicker somehow, as if it contained more moisture or different gases than normal atmosphere. The temperature was at least 10 degrees colder than the rest of the building, cold enough that I could see my breath misting in the dim emergency lighting. When I stepped out of the elevator, my footsteps echoed in a way that suggested vast space, far more space than should have been possible given the building's footprint. The floor beneath my feet was made of some kind of black stone that I didn't recognize, polished to a mirror finish that reflected the sparse lighting in strange, distorted ways. The walls, what I could see of them in the limited visibility, appeared to be made of the same dark material, but they seemed to curve and twist in geometries that hurt to look at directly, as if they were designed according to mathematical principles that human eyes weren't meant to process. As my vision adjusted to the dim lighting, I began to make out the layout of floor 13, and nothing about it made architectural sense. The ceiling was impossibly high, stretching up into darkness beyond what the building's foundation should have been able to accommodate. There were corridors leading off in directions that should have intersected with the neighboring buildings, passages that extended far beyond the boundaries of the Meridian Tower's lot. And strangest of all, there were apartment doors lining these corridors, dozens of them, each marked with numbers that followed no logical sequence I could understand. Comment below if you think I should have gotten back in that elevator immediately, because what I did next was probably the biggest mistake of my life. Instead of returning to the 28th floor and pretending this impossible place didn't exist, I decided to explore. I needed to understand what I was seeing, needed to find some rational explanation for this underground level that violated every law of physics and architecture I knew. I walked deeper into floor 13, my footsteps echoing off the strange stone surfaces, following one of the impossibly long corridors lined with apartment doors. The first door I examined was marked 7, a combination of symbols that made no mathematical sense. I pressed my ear against the door and heard something that made my skin crawl. The sound of multiple voices having a conversation in a language I didn't recognize, speaking in rhythms and intonations that seemed almost musical, but fundamentally wrong, as if human vocal cords weren't designed to produce those particular sounds. I moved to the next door, marked Xiao 3, and heard what sounded like children laughing, but the laughter went on too long, never pausing for breath, never varying in pitch or intensity. The further I walked into floor 13, the more obvious it became that this place existed according to rules that had nothing to do with normal reality. The corridor I was following had been stretching in a straight line for what felt like half a mile, far beyond the physical boundaries of the building. But when I turned around to look back toward the elevator, it appeared to be only about 50 feet behind me. The apartment doors were numbered with symbols and combinations that seemed to change slightly each time I looked at them directly, as if the markings were somehow unstable or shifting between different states of existence. Share your own experiences with impossible architecture in the comments below, because what happened next made me realize that floor 13 wasn't just an architectural anomaly, it was inhabited by things that shouldn't exist in our reality. As I continued exploring, I began to hear sounds coming from behind the apartment doors that were definitely not human, scratching, like claws on metal, wet sliding sounds, as if something large and slimy was moving across the floors inside, and underneath it all, a low humming that seemed to come from the walls themselves, a vibration that I could feel in my bones and teeth, as if the entire impossible floor was somehow alive and breathing. That's when I saw the first resident of floor 13. And the sight of her will be burned into my memory for the rest of my life. She was standing at the end of the corridor I was following, and at first glance, she looked like a perfectly normal woman in her 30s, wearing a simple white dress and staring in my direction with what appeared to be curiosity. But as I got closer, I began to notice details that made my primitive brain scream warnings that something was fundamentally wrong with this picture. Her shadow was falling in the wrong direction relative to the lighting, and it was the wrong shape, stretching and twisting like it belonged to something much larger and more angular than the human figure casting it. Paragraph 2. The residents of floor 13, 2,000 words. The woman at the end of the corridor smiled when she saw me approaching, and that smile was the first thing that made me realize I was in terrible danger. It was too wide, stretching literally from ear to ear in a way that human facial muscles simply cannot achieve without tearing. Her teeth were perfectly white and perfectly straight, but there were too many of them. Multiple rows like a shark's mouth, and they continued back into her throat further than should have been anatomically possible. When she spoke, her voice sounded normal, pleasant even, but the words came from everywhere at once, as if the air itself was speaking rather than her vocal cords. "You're new here," she said, and though her lips moved in sync with the words, I could somehow sense that the sound was being generated by something else entirely, something that was using her body like a ventriloquist's dummy. "We don't get many visitors from the upper floors. Most people don't know how to find the button when the power goes out. You must be very curious, or very lost, to have come so far from where you belong. Let me know in the comments if you've ever met someone who seemed human, but felt completely wrong on some instinctual level, because every survival instinct I possessed was telling me to run from this woman as fast as I could." I tried to respond, tried to ask her who she was and how long she had lived on floor 13, but my voice came out as barely a whisper. There was something about her presence that seemed to compress the air around me, making it difficult to breathe normally or speak at full volume. She seemed to understand my distress and stepped closer, her movements fluid and graceful, but somehow wrong, as if she were floating just slightly above the ground rather than walking on it. "My name is Margaret," she said, "and I've been a resident here for, well, time works differently on this floor, so it's hard to say exactly how long. Some of us have been here since before the building was constructed. Others arrived more recently when they pressed the wrong button or took the wrong elevator or made the wrong choice at just the right moment. Would you like to meet some of your new neighbors? I think they'd be very interested to learn about someone from the 28th floor." Before I could answer, before I could explain that I wasn't planning to stay and that I just wanted to understand what this place was, Margaret reached out and took my hand. Her touch was ice cold, so cold that it burned, and I could feel something like electricity running through her fingers and into my skin. The moment our skin made contact, the impossible corridor around us seemed to shimmer and change, revealing details that I hadn't been able to see before. Hit the like button if this supernatural transformation is making your skin crawl, because what I saw when Margaret touched me was beyond anything I could have prepared myself for. The apartment doors that had seemed normal from a distance were revealed to be made of materials that shouldn't exist. Some appeared to be carved from single pieces of bone, others looked like they were constructed from crystallized blood, and still others seemed to be made of something that looked like metal but moved and flowed like liquid. The numbers and symbols on the doors weren't just changing. They were alive, crawling across the surfaces like insects made of light, rearranging themselves in patterns that hurt to look at directly. Margaret led me toward one of the doors, this one marked with what looked like a combination of mathematical symbols and hieroglyphs that seemed to writhe and shift as we approached. "This is where the Hendersons live," she said conversationally, as if we were just neighbors meeting in a normal apartment hallway. "They've been here since 1993, when they got trapped in the elevator during the earthquake. Well, there wasn't actually an earthquake that year in Chicago, but there was one in their version of 1993, and that's when they found their way down here. They're lovely people, very quiet, though they do tend to phase in and out of existence on Tuesdays." She knocked on the door, and after a moment it opened to reveal what looked like a perfectly ordinary middle-aged couple, a man in a cardigan and khakis, a woman in a floral dress, both smiling warmly, as if they were welcoming guests to a dinner party. But like Margaret, there were details about them that made my brain struggle to process what I was seeing. The man's reflection in the polished black stone floor showed him as a much younger person, maybe in his 20s, while the woman's shadow moved independently of her body, gesturing and turning its head as if it were a separate entity entirely. "Oh, how wonderful!" the woman exclaimed, clapping her hands together in delight. "We haven't had a visitor from upstairs in months. Please, come in, come in. I was just making coffee, and we'd love to hear about what's happening in the world above. Are the Cubs still playing baseball? We haven't been able to get clear reception on our television since the digital conversion. Subscribe if you want to hear more about the impossible residents of supernatural floors, because the invitation to enter their apartment filled me with a dread so profound that I could barely stand upright. Every instinct I possessed was screaming at me not to cross that threshold, not to enter a space that existed in defiance of natural law. But Margaret's grip on my hand was impossibly strong, and she was already guiding me through the doorway into the Hendersons' impossible home. The interior of their apartment was decorated like a typical middle-class American living room from the early 1990s, floral wallpaper, a large CRT television, a couch covered in protective plastic, family photos arranged on side tables. But the family photos showed the same two people in various stages of aging and youth, sometimes as children, sometimes as elderly adults, sometimes as people who looked vaguely similar but weren't quite the same individuals. The television was showing what appeared to be a news broadcast, but the anchors were speaking in reverse, and the text scrolling across the bottom of the screen was in languages that didn't exist in any reality I knew. Sit, mister, Henderson insisted, gesturing toward the plastic-covered couch. We get so few visitors down here. Most people who find floor 13 either turn around immediately or, well, let's not talk about the ones who don't turn around. That's not appropriate conversation for company. He sat down across from me in a recliner that creaked ominously under his weight, and I noticed that his feet didn't quite reach the floor, as if the furniture had been sized for people much larger than normal humans. Mrs. Henderson brought coffee in delicate china cups, and the liquid inside was perfectly black, so dark that it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. When I politely declined to drink it, explaining that I was trying to cut back on caffeine, she looked genuinely hurt. "Oh, but it's our special blend," she said sadly. "We grow the beans ourselves in the community garden. They only bloom under the artificial moonlight we have down here, and the taste is absolutely unique. Most people find it quite transformative. Comment below what you think was really in that coffee, because the way both Hendersons were staring at me, waiting for me to drink it, made it clear that this was some kind of test or ritual that I definitely didn't want to participate in. I set the cup down on the coffee table and tried to steer the conversation toward understanding what floor 13 actually was, how long it had existed, and how many people lived down here. "Oh, the floor has always been here," Mr. Henderson said matter-of-factly, as if I had asked about the weather. "Well, not always, but it's been here longer than the building above it. Buildings like the Meridian Tower, they're not really built so much as they're grown, you see. They start with a foundation in normal space, but as they get taller, they begin to stretch into other dimensions, other versions of reality. Floor 13 is where all the possibilities that didn't happen get stored, where all the people who made different choices end up living. It's quite lovely once you get used to it." Mrs. Henderson nodded enthusiastically. "We have residents from all sorts of different timelines and realities. There's the Johnson family from the dimension where the Chicago fire never ended, the Patels from the reality where Lake Michigan dried up in the 1970s, and that nice young man from the timeline where the Cubs won the World Series every year since 1908. Everyone ends up here eventually, once they realize that their version of reality isn't quite compatible with the standard model of existence. The more they talked, the more obvious it became that the residents of Floor 13 weren't just people who had gotten lost or made wrong turns. They were individuals whose very existence had somehow become incompatible with normal reality, people who had slipped through cracks in the fabric of space and time and ended up in this impossible place between floors. And the way they were looking at me, with a mixture of hope and hunger, suggested that they thought I might be joining them permanently. Margaret, who had been standing silently by the door during my conversation with the Hendersons, finally spoke up. "We should show him more of the floor," she said, and there was something in her tone that sounded almost possessive. "He should meet everyone, see all the amenities we have down here. The community center, the library, the garden where we grow things that don't exist. I think once he sees how comfortable life can be on floor 13, he might decide to stay voluntarily." That word, voluntarily, sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the supernatural cold permeating the impossible floor. It implied that there were people who had decided to stay involuntarily, people who had been given the same tour I was receiving and had somehow found themselves unable to return to the world above. I stood up from the plastic-covered couch, every movement feeling like it was being performed underwater or in thick syrup, and tried to explain that I needed to get back to my own apartment, that people would be worried about me if I stayed away too long. The Hendersons exchanged a look that made my blood run cold, a look of pity mixed with something that might have been anticipation. "Oh dear," Mrs. Henderson said softly. "I don't think he understands yet. Should we tell him, or should we let him figure it out on his own?" Share your thoughts in the comments about what the Hendersons meant, because what happened next made me realize that visiting floor 13 hadn't been a simple case of pressing the wrong button during a power outage. As I tried to walk toward the door, I discovered that my movements were becoming increasingly difficult, as if the air itself was thickening around me, as if the very space I was trying to move through was becoming more solid with each step. Margaret was still holding my hand, and her grip had become so tight that I could feel my bones beginning to ache. But when I tried to pull away, I found that I couldn't break free from her grasp. "The thing about floor 13, Margaret explained conversationally, as if she were discussing the weather rather than my apparent imprisonment, is that it exists in a state of quantum possibility. Everyone who lives here made a choice at some point in their lives that led them away from the standard timeline. And once you've seen this place, once you've breathed the air and walked the corridors and met the residents, you become part of that same quantum state. You become someone who exists in the spaces between normal reality. The implications of what she was saying hit me like a physical blow, and I felt panic rising in my throat like bile. This wasn't just a supernatural floor hidden in my apartment building. It was a trap, a place where people who had somehow stepped outside the boundaries of normal existence were collected and kept. And by pressing that impossible button and exploring this impossible place, I had somehow marked myself as someone who belonged here, rather than in the world above. Paragraph 3. The truth about floor. 13. 2,000 words. As the full horror of my situation began to sink in, I felt something fundamental shifting in the air around me, as if the very molecules of floor 13 were reorganizing themselves to accommodate my presence as a permanent resident rather than a temporary visitor. The Hendersons' apartment, which had seemed merely unsettling moments before, now felt actively hostile, with the walls appearing to pulse like living tissue and the family photographs rearranging themselves to include images of me that couldn't possibly have been taken. Margaret's grip on my hand had become so tight that I could no longer feel my fingers, and when I looked down, I saw that her skin was beginning to merge with mine, creating a connection that looked less like physical contact and more like two substances melding together at a molecular level. "Don't panic," Margaret said gently, as if she were comforting a child afraid of the dark rather than someone who was being absorbed into a supernatural prison. "The transition is always frightening at first, but once it's complete, you'll find that life on floor 13 is quite pleasant. We have everything you need here: community, purpose, and most importantly, belonging. You'll never have to worry about fitting in with the world above again. Never have to pretend to be someone you're not just to maintain your place in ordinary reality." Let me know in the comments if you've ever felt like you didn't quite belong in the normal world, because what Margaret was offering was a seductive kind of escape from all the struggles and disappointments of regular human existence. But even as part of me was tempted by the promise of a place where I could finally belong, the rational part of my mind was screaming that this was wrong, that whatever floor 13 offered came at a price that was too high to pay. I tried once more to pull away from Margaret's grasp, putting all my strength into breaking free from her supernatural hold, and for a moment, I felt our merged skin beginning to separate. The pain was extraordinary, like tearing off a bandage that had been fused to a healing wound, but I gritted my teeth and kept pulling until my hand came free with a wet, tearing sound that made my stomach lurch with nausea. The moment I broke contact with Margaret, the apartment around us began to change in ways that made my eyes water, and my brain struggle to process what I was seeing. The walls started to bend and twist, revealing that what I had taken to be a normal rectangular room was actually a space with far too many corners, angles that intersected in geometrically impossible ways. The Hendersons, who had seemed like a harmless if eccentric elderly couple, began to show their true nature as their human facades started to slip and crack like masks made of plaster. Hit the like button if this reality distortion is making you dizzy, because what I saw when their disguises fell away was beyond anything I could have nightmared on my own. Mr. Saw. Henderson's kindly face split open like a flower blooming, revealing rows of teeth arranged in concentric circles around a throat that disappeared into darkness deeper than should have been possible in a human body. Mrs. Henderson's floral dress began to move independently of her body, the pattern coming alive and crawling across her skin like living tattoos, while her eyes multiplied, spreading across her face and neck until she had dozens of them, all staring at me with expressions of hunger and desperate need. "You can't leave now," she said, but her voice was coming from all those eyes simultaneously, creating a chorus of sound that made the air itself vibrate with malevolent energy. "You've seen too much, learned too much about what we really are. The elevator won't take you back to the upper floors now that you know the truth. Floor 13 has claimed you, just like it claimed all of us when we made the mistake of looking too closely at the spaces between normal reality." I turned toward the door, desperate to escape from the Henderson apartment and get back to the elevator, but when I tried to run, I discovered that the corridor outside had changed. Instead of the long, straight hallway I had walked down to reach their door, I found myself in a maze of passages that branched and twisted in every direction, each one lined with apartment doors that pulsed with their own internal light. The polished black stone floor had become uneven and organic, rising and falling like breathing, and I could hear sounds coming from behind every door, crying, laughing, screaming, singing, all blending together into a cacophony of human emotion that had been twisted into something inhuman. Subscribe if you want to hear more about escaping supernatural traps, because what happened next was my first real glimpse of hope since I had pressed that impossible button. As I stumbled through the maze of corridors, trying to find my way back to the elevator, I began to notice that some of the apartment doors were different from the others. While most were marked with those shifting, impossible symbols, a few displayed normal apartment numbers in standard fonts. Numbers like 2847, which was my own apartment number, and 1205 and 3622, which I recognized as addresses from the floors above. When I pressed my ear against the door marked 2847, I could hear the familiar sounds of my own apartment. The hum of my refrigerator, the tick of the clock on my kitchen wall, the distant sound of traffic from the street 28 floors below. It was as if floor 13 contained not just impossible spaces and supernatural residents, but also doorways that connected to every apartment in the building above. The realization hit me like a thunderbolt. This wasn't just a hidden floor, it was a nexus point, a place where all the apartments in the Meridian Tower intersected with each other and with realities that existed outside normal space and time. I tried the handle of the door marked with my apartment number, hoping against hope that it would open and allow me to escape back to my own familiar reality. But the door was locked, and when I looked more closely, I could see that it required a key that I didn't possess. Not a normal key, but something that looked like it had been carved from the same strange black stone that made up the floors and walls of this impossible place. Comment below if you think I should have tried to break down the door, because what I did instead was probably the only thing that saved me from becoming a permanent resident of floor 13. Instead of trying to force my way through a door that was clearly meant to keep me out, I began searching the maze of corridors for other residents, hoping to find someone who might be able to tell me how to get back to the elevator, how to reverse whatever process had brought me to this supernatural prison. The first person I encountered was a young man in his 20s who introduced himself as David and claimed to have been living on floor 13 since 2003 when he had gotten trapped in the elevator during what he called the incident with the temporal anomaly. Unlike Margaret and the Hendersons, David still looked completely human, with no obvious supernatural alterations or disturbing physical characteristics. But when I asked him about escaping, about finding a way back to the world above, his expression became sad and distant. "You don't escape from floor 13, he told me matter-of-factly. You learn to accept it, and eventually you learn to love it. The residents here, we're all people who never quite fit in the normal world anyway. We were the ones who always felt like something was missing, like we were living in the wrong reality, like we belonged somewhere else. Floor 13 is that somewhere else. It's where people go when ordinary existence becomes too painful or too limiting to bear." As David spoke, I began to understand that floor 13 wasn't just a supernatural trap. It was a place that called to people who were already disconnected from normal reality, people who had spent their lives feeling like they didn't belong in the world they had been born into. The residents weren't prisoners in the traditional sense. They were refugees from a reality that had never felt like home, and they had found sanctuary in a place that existed outside the boundaries of normal space and time. But even as I understood the appeal of what floor 13 offered, I knew with absolute certainty that I didn't want to stay. I had a life in the world above, people who would miss me, responsibilities and relationships that mattered to me. I wasn't ready to give up on ordinary reality, wasn't ready to accept that I was so fundamentally incompatible with normal existence that I belonged in a place like this. Share your own experiences with feeling like you don't belong in the comments below, because the psychological pull of floor 13 was almost as strong as its supernatural effects. As I continued exploring the maze of corridors, talking to more residents and learning about their stories, I found myself beginning to understand why someone might choose to stay. Every person I met had a tale of isolation, of feeling different, of struggling to find their place in a world that seemed designed for people who were fundamentally unlike them. There was Sarah, who had lived on floor 13 since the 1980s, after discovering that she could see glimpses of alternate timelines and parallel realities, visions that had made it impossible for her to function in normal society. There was Marcus, who had arrived in the 1990s when his ability to phase partially out of physical existence had made it impossible for him to maintain normal human relationships. There was Elena, who had found floor 13 in 2010, after her prophetic dreams had become so vivid and accurate that she could no longer distinguish between sleeping and waking life. But hearing all these stories, Understanding the pain and isolation that had driven these people to accept floor 13 as their permanent home only strengthened my resolve to find a way out. I refused to believe that feeling different or disconnected meant that I belonged in a supernatural prison, no matter how comfortable or accepting that prison might be. There had to be a way back to the elevator, back to the world above, back to the messy and imperfect but ultimately real life I had been living for 28 years. It was Elena who finally gave me the key to understanding how floor 13 really worked, though I don't think she intended to help me escape. As she was telling me about her prophetic dreams and how they had led her to this impossible place, she mentioned something that made my blood run cold. The thing about floor 13, she said sadly, is that it feeds on the belief that you don't belong anywhere else. The stronger that belief becomes, the more solid this place gets around you, the more impossible it becomes to leave. But in those first few hours, before you've fully accepted that this is your home, there's still a chance to break free. The elevator will still respond to someone who truly, completely believes they belong in the world above. Share this video with someone who's ever felt trapped by their own thoughts, because what Elena was describing wasn't just supernatural imprisonment, it was a psychological trap that used people's own insecurities and feelings of alienation against them. The residents of floor 13 weren't being held here by external force. They were being held by their own conviction that they didn't deserve or couldn't handle life in normal reality. And the longer they stayed, the more true that became, until the supernatural floor became the only place where they could exist. I thanked Elena for her inadvertent help, and began making my way back through the maze of corridors, focusing all my mental energy on a single thought. I belong on the 28th floor of the Meridian Tower, in apartment 2847, in the real world, with real problems and real relationships and real responsibilities. I pictured my actual apartment in vivid detail. The scratched hardwood floors, the kitchen window that looked out over the Chicago skyline, the bookshelf filled with novels I had been meaning to read, the bed where I slept alone, but contentedly most nights. The more I focused on these concrete details of my real life, the more the impossible architecture of floor 13 began to waver and blur around me. The maze of corridors started to straighten out, the organic black stone floor became flat and regular, and the apartment doors with their shifting supernatural symbols began to look more like normal residential doors. But I could hear the residents behind me calling out, their voices filled with desperation and longing, begging me not to leave them alone in their interdimensional exile. "Don't go back," Margaret's voice echoed through the corridors, distorted by distance and supernatural acoustics. "You'll never find another place where you can be yourself completely, where you don't have to pretend or compromise or settle for less than perfect understanding. The world above will disappoint you again and again, will make you feel small and ordinary and forgettable. Stay with us, where you can matter, where you can be special." Comment below if you've ever been tempted to give up on real life because it's too difficult or disappointing. Because Margaret's words were designed to target every insecurity and fear I had about returning to ordinary existence. But I kept walking, kept focusing on the concrete reality of my life above, and gradually I began to see the familiar red glow of emergency lighting ahead of me. Paragraph 4. The desperate escape. 2,000 words. The elevator was exactly where I had left it, its doors standing open like the mouth of some mechanical beast waiting to devour me. But something was different about it now. The interior looked wrong, distorted as if it existed partially in floor 13's impossible geometry and partially in normal reality. The button panel showed both the standard floor numbers and those shifting supernatural symbols I had seen throughout the impossible floor, and I could hear sounds coming from inside the elevator car that definitely didn't belong in any mechanical system designed by human engineers. Let me know in the comments if you've ever had to make a choice between safety and freedom, because stepping into that elevator required more courage than I had ever needed for anything in my entire life. Every instinct I possessed was telling me that the elevator was no longer a simple conveyance between floors, but had become something hybrid, something that existed in the space between normal reality and the supernatural realm I was trying to escape. But it was the only way out, the only path back to the world I belonged in. So I forced myself to step inside despite the overwhelming sense of wrongness that filled the air around me. The moment I crossed the threshold into the elevator, I felt the temperature drop another 10 degrees, and my breath began coming out in thick clouds of vapor that hung in the air like fog. The walls of the elevator car were covered in a thin layer of frost that formed patterns too complex and beautiful to be natural, geometric designs that seemed to shift and change as I watched them. The floor beneath my feet felt unstable, as if it were made of something more liquid than solid, and I had to grip the handrail to keep from losing my balance as the elevator began to move without my pressing any buttons. But instead of going up toward the residential floors, the elevator began descending even deeper into the building's impossible depths. The digital floor indicator was displaying symbols that hurt to look at directly, shapes that seemed to exist in too many dimensions for human eyes to process. I could hear Margaret and the other residents of floor 13 calling to me from somewhere outside the elevator car, their voices growing more desperate and distorted with each passing second. Hit the like button if this supernatural elevator ride is making your palms sweat, because what happened next was the most terrifying part of my entire experience. As the elevator descended deeper into whatever lay beneath floor 13, I began to see things moving in the frost-covered walls, shadows that belonged to nothing I could identify, shapes that writhed and twisted like living creatures trapped in ice. The elevator car itself started to change around me, the familiar rectangular space warping into geometries that made my head spin with vertigo and confusion. I realized with growing horror that the elevator wasn't taking me back to the normal floors of the Meridian Tower. It was carrying me deeper into the supernatural infrastructure that existed beneath the building, into spaces that were even more removed from reality than floor 13 had been. I was being taken to whatever served as the source or foundation of the impossible floor, the engine that powered its reality-defying existence. Desperate to regain control of the situation, I began pressing buttons on the elevator panel, trying to find one that would take me back up to the residential floors. But every button I pressed seemed to make the situation worse. Pressing P1 caused the walls to start bleeding a thick black substance that smelled like rotting flowers. Pressing the button for the lobby made the floor of the elevator car become transparent, revealing an endless abyss below us that stretched down into darkness so complete it seemed to have physical weight. Subscribe if you want to hear more about fighting back against supernatural forces, because what I did next was probably the only thing that saved me from being lost forever in the building's impossible depths. Instead of continuing to press random buttons and hoping for the best, I focused all my mental energy on visualizing the 28th floor, on remembering exactly what it felt like to press the button marked 28, with the confidence of someone who belonged there. I reached out to the button panel and pressed 28, not with the desperate panic I had been feeling, but with the calm certainty of someone who was simply going home after a long day at work. The moment my finger made contact with that familiar button, I felt something shift in the fabric of reality around me. The supernatural frost on the walls began to melt and evaporate. The impossible geometries of the elevator car started to resolve themselves into normal rectangular space, and the terrifying abyss beneath the floor solidified back into ordinary industrial carpeting. The elevator lurched once, made that familiar grinding sound that all old elevators make, and began to rise. The digital floor indicator went through its usual sequence: P3, P2, P1, L2, 3, 4. Each number appearing in clear, normal white digits that didn't hurt to look at or shift into incomprehensible symbols. I could feel the supernatural presence that had been pressing down on me throughout my time on floor 13 beginning to lift, like a weight being removed from my shoulders, like breathing fresh air after being trapped in a room filled with smoke. But even as the elevator carried me back toward the normal world, I could still hear the voices of floor 13's residents calling to me, their words echoing up through the elevator shaft like cries from the bottom of a deep well. They were pleading with me to come back, to reconsider, to accept the belonging and acceptance they had offered me. And underneath their voices, I could hear something else, a sound like grinding metal mixed with organic decay, as if floor 13 itself were angry about my escape and was trying to reach up through the building's infrastructure to reclaim me. Comment below what you think that sound really was. Because as the elevator rose past floor 15, then floor 20, then floor 25, the grinding, organic noise grew louder and more insistent. The walls of the elevator began to vibrate, and I could feel something large and malevolent moving in the spaces between the floors, something that was connected to floor 13 and was not happy about losing a potential resident. When the elevator finally reached the 28th floor and the doors opened with their familiar ding, I half expected to find myself back in the impossible corridors of floor 13, trapped in some supernatural loop that would keep me cycling between realities forever. But what I saw was the wonderfully ordinary beige-carpeted hallway of my actual floor, with its fluorescent lighting and numbered apartment doors, and the faint smell of someone cooking dinner somewhere down the hall. I stepped out of the elevator on shaking legs and turned to look back at the button panel one more time. The button for floor 13 was gone, vanished as if it had never existed, leaving only the standard arrangement of numbers that I had seen every day for the past 2 years. But I knew that it would be back, probably during the next power outage, probably when someone else made the same mistake I had made and pressed the wrong button at exactly the wrong moment. Share your thoughts on whether I should have warned building management, because what I discovered when I finally made it back to my own apartment was that no time had passed in the normal world during my experience on floor 13. According to every clock in my apartment, according to my phone and my computer, it was still the same night I had come home from work, still the same storm raging outside my windows. Somehow, the hours I had spent exploring the impossible floor and meeting its supernatural residents had occurred in a pocket of time that existed outside normal chronology. I tried to convince myself that the whole experience had been some kind of hallucination, brought on by stress and exhaustion, that floor 13 had never existed, and that I had simply had a very vivid nightmare while trapped in a malfunctioning elevator during the power outage. But when I looked down at my hands, I could see the marks where Margaret had gripped me, faint bruises in the exact pattern of her fingers, proof that what I had experienced was real and physical and dangerous. Over the following days, I began to research the history of the Meridian Tower, trying to understand what I had discovered in the building's impossible depths. What I found in old city records and architectural plans was disturbing but not entirely surprising. The building had been constructed on the site of a much older structure, a boarding house that had burned down in the 1920s with several residents trapped inside. Before that, the lot had been home to a small apartment building that had collapsed during a gas explosion in the 1890s, killing most of the people who lived there. The pattern was clear. For over a century, this particular piece of Chicago real estate had been the site of residential buildings where people had died suddenly, tragically, without warning. And according to everything I had learned from the residents of floor 13, the supernatural floor served as a kind of collection point for people who had become disconnected from normal reality, people whose existence had become incompatible with the standard model of space and time. Let me know in the comments if you think floor 13 is still there, because 6 months later, I still live in the Meridian Tower, still take the elevator up to the 28th floor every day, and I'm still watching for that impossible button to reappear. I've never seen it again, but I know it's there, waiting for the next power outage, the next moment of uncertainty when the building's electrical systems flicker and reveal the supernatural infrastructure that exists alongside our ordinary world. Paragraph 5. Living with the knowledge. 2,000 words. The hardest part about surviving an encounter with floor 13 isn't the lingering fear or the supernatural marks that still ache when the weather changes. It's the knowledge that I carry with me every day. The awareness that reality is far more fragile and permeable than most people realize. 6 months have passed since that night, and I still jump every time the elevator makes an unusual sound, still check the button panel obsessively every time I ride up to my floor, still feel my heart racing whenever there's a power outage in the building. But more than that, I now see signs of supernatural instability everywhere I look, evidence that floor 13 was just one small example of a much larger phenomenon that most people are completely unaware of. Let me know in the comments if you've started noticing things that don't quite fit after reading this story, because once you know that impossible spaces can exist within ordinary buildings, you begin to see them everywhere.
I've spotted apartment buildings with floor numbers that skip in impossible sequences, office towers with elevators that occasionally display destinations that don't correspond to any actual floors, shopping malls with corridors that are longer or shorter than their architectural footprints should allow. The world is full of spaces that exist partially outside normal reality, places where the boundaries between dimensions have worn thin enough to allow impossible things to bleed through. The residents of my building have no idea what lurks beneath their homes, what supernatural infrastructure exists in the spaces between their comfortable, ordinary apartments. They ride the same elevators I do, press the same buttons, live their lives in blissful ignorance of the fact that they are separated from an interdimensional prison by nothing more than a power grid that occasionally fails and reveals buttons that shouldn't exist. Sometimes I wonder if I should warn them, should find a way to tell them about floor 13 without sounding like I'm having some kind of psychological breakdown. But what would be the point? Most people who pressed that impossible button would probably be exactly the kind of individuals who would find floor 13 appealing, people who feel disconnected from normal reality, people who struggle to find their place in the ordinary world, people who might genuinely be better off in a supernatural space designed for those who don't quite fit anywhere else. And the people who would never be tempted by what floor 13 offers are the same people who would never press an unknown button in an elevator
during a power outage in the first place. Hit the like button if you think some knowledge is too dangerous to share, because I've come to realize that Floor 13 serves a function in the cosmic order of things, a purpose that might actually be necessary, even if it's terrifying. The world is full of people who feel like they don't belong, who struggle with the limitations and disappointments of ordinary existence, who spend their lives searching for a place where they can be truly understood and accepted. For most of these people, the search eventually leads to some form of peace. They find their community, their purpose, their way of being in the world that feels authentic and sustainable. But for some, the disconnection from normal reality runs so deep that no amount of therapy or medication or lifestyle change can bridge the gap between who they are and what the world expects them to be. These are the people who end up on Floor 13, not as prisoners, but as refugees from a reality that was never able to accommodate their particular form of existence. And while the supernatural floor may be terrifying to observe from the outside, for its residents, it represents the first place they have ever truly felt at home. The psychological impact of understanding this has been almost as challenging as the supernatural encounter itself. There are nights when I lie awake in my perfectly ordinary apartment, staring at the ceiling and wondering if I made the right choice in fighting so hard to return to this world. My life on the 28th floor is comfortable but not particularly meaningful, successful but not deeply fulfilling, connected but not profoundly intimate. I have friends and colleagues and romantic relationships, but none of them know about the most significant experience I've ever had. None of them would understand if I tried to explain what I discovered in the depths of my own building. Subscribe if you want to hear more about the psychological aftermath of supernatural encounters, because the isolation that comes with carrying this kind of knowledge is almost unbearable sometimes. I've found myself envying the residents of Floor 13 their complete honesty with each other, their ability to exist without pretense or performance, their freedom from the constant effort required to maintain a place in ordinary society. Margaret was right when she said that the world above would continue to disappoint me. It does regularly and predictably, in ways both small and large. But I've also come to understand that disappointment and struggle and imperfection are not flaws in the system of normal reality. They are features. The difficulties of ordinary existence, the effort required to build and maintain relationships with flawed and complicated people, the ongoing work of finding meaning and purpose in a world that doesn't automatically provide either one. These challenges are what give life weight and substance and value. The perfect acceptance offered by Floor 13 comes at the cost of growth, change, surprise, and the kind of messy, complicated love that can only exist between people who choose to be together despite their differences and difficulties. I've started volunteering at a crisis counseling center downtown, working with people who are struggling with feelings of disconnection and alienation, people who sometimes express the same kinds of thoughts and emotions that drove the residents of Floor 13 to accept exile from normal reality. I can't tell them about the supernatural floor that exists beneath my apartment building, can't warn them about the dangerous appeal of spaces that promise perfect belonging and understanding. But I can listen to them, can validate their feelings of not quite fitting in, while also helping them find ways to build bridges between who they are and how they can exist in the ordinary world. Comment below if you think I'm doing the right thing, because sometimes I wonder if I'm interfering with the natural process, preventing people who might genuinely belong on Floor 13 from finding their way to the place where they could finally be at peace. But then I remember the desperation in Margaret's voice when she begged me not to leave. The way the Hendersons looked at me with such hungry need for connection with someone from the world above. The overall sense of stagnation and decay that permeated the impossible floor despite its residents' claims of contentment. Floor 13 may offer perfect acceptance and understanding, but it doesn't offer growth or change or the possibility of becoming something more than what you already are. Its residents are frozen in the moment of their greatest disconnection from normal reality, preserved like insects in amber, unable to move forward or backward or anywhere at all. They have found a place where they belong, but they have paid for that belonging with their potential for transformation, discovery, and surprise. The elevator in the Meridian Tower still functions normally most of the time, carrying residents and visitors up and down between the ordinary floors where ordinary people live, ordinary lives full of ordinary struggles and joys. But I know that during the next major storm, when the power grid fails and the emergency systems flicker, that impossible button will reappear between P3 and the lobby. Someone else will see it. Someone else will be curious enough to press it. And someone else will have to choose between the seductive promise of perfect belonging and the difficult but ultimately more rewarding path of finding their place in the messy, complicated, disappointing, wonderful world above. Share this story with someone who's ever felt like they don't belong anywhere, because the truth is that most of us feel that way sometimes. And the feeling is not evidence that we need to find some supernatural refuge from reality. It's evidence that we're human, that we're alive, that we're capable of imagining something better than what currently exists. The longing for perfect understanding and acceptance is not a flaw to be cured or escaped. It's the engine that drives us to keep trying, keep connecting, keep building the kinds of relationships and communities that can accommodate our weird and wonderful and irredeemably imperfect humanity. I still live in the Meridian Tower, still ride the elevator to the 28th floor, still watch for signs that floor 13 is stirring in the building's supernatural depths. But I'm no longer afraid of it, because I understand now that it can only claim people who have already given up on the possibility of finding their place in the ordinary world. As long as I keep fighting for connection, keep working to build bridges between my inner reality and external existence, keep believing that I can find meaning and purpose and love in this difficult but ultimately precious life, Floor 13 will remain nothing more than an impossible destination on an elevator that I will never be tempted to visit again. The residents of Floor 13 made their choice, and they found the peace they were looking for, even if that peace came at a price I was unwilling to pay. But their story doesn't end with supernatural imprisonment. It ends with the knowledge that even in a reality as strange and terrible and wonderful as ours, there is always somewhere for everyone to belong, even if that somewhere exists in the spaces between the floors we think we know.